My brother showed up to our mother's funeral with a copy of the will in his hand, and a smile he was trying to pass off as grief. His wife stood beside him in black heels and pearls, looking more prepared for a luncheon than a burial. The service had barely ended. People were still holding paper cups of coffee and balancing sympathy casseroles in foil pans. Then Andrea laughed and said, "You weren't family, you were free labor." My brother Mark nodded toward the house keys in my hand. "You lived here rent-free," he said. "That was your payment." The whole family looked at me, at my dress, at my face, at the woman who had spent 6 years bathing our mother, lifting our mother, feeding our mother, and sleeping in 40-minute pieces. They looked at me like maybe he had a point. So I took the paper, I read the will, then I started laughing. Because in that moment, standing in my mother's church fellowship hall with potato salad sweating on folding tables and funeral flowers starting to lean, I realized something simple. They hadn't even read the right will. Now let me take you back. My mother's name was Helen Parker. She was the kind of woman people called strong when they meant difficult to argue with. She made lists for everything. Groceries, bills, birthdays, medication reminders even before she needed medication herself. She lived in the same split-level house outside Dayton for 38 years. Brick front, green shutters, a backyard too small for gardening, but she tried anyway. My brother Mark was her favorite in the way families pretend not to notice. He was the firstborn, the son, the one she always described as ambitious. I was Claire, the daughter with a good heart. That's how it starts in some families. One child gets praised for potential. The other gets praised for usefulness. Mark moved to Columbus after college and built the kind of life my mother could brag about to church friends. Sales, bonuses, a wife with expensive hair, country club charity dinners, holiday cards printed on thick paper. Andrea fit him perfectly, polished, careful, always dressed like someone might be taking photos. She laughed at the right moments and touched my mother's arm a lot in public. I don't think she ever liked me. Not openly. Just in the quiet way some women make it clear they've sorted you into a lower category. I stayed in Dayton. I had a job in medical billing, then a divorce, then a smaller apartment. Then eventually I moved back into my mother's house, though not the way people later described it. Not because I couldn't survive, because my mother had a stroke. It happened on a cold Wednesday in March. I remember because I was in the grocery store holding 2 different coffee creamers when the hospital called. That's the kind of detail grief preserves. The ridiculous, ordinary thing that existed 1 second before everything split in 2. By the time I reached the emergency room, Mark was already there. His tie was loose, his face pale in a way that almost looked sincere. "It's bad," he said. And it was. The stroke left my mother half paralyzed. Her speech slurred, her right side weak. The doctors used words like rehabilitation and long-term care and realistic expectations. Mark asked smart questions, nodded a lot, took notes on his phone. Then 48 hours later, while we sat in a hospital cafeteria that smelled like burned coffee and bleach, he said, "I can help financially." I looked at him over a carton of untouched pudding. "But," he glanced down, "but I can't move my whole life back here." I nodded once. There it was. The sentence he had probably been building toward since the ambulance ride. "I have a career," he added, "and Andrea's parents are nearby. We're trying for a second house. It's complicated." Complicated. That word men use when they mean expensive for them. "And me?" I asked. He looked up then. "You're local." That was all. Just 2 words. "You're local." As if geography creates destiny. As if being born 20 minutes closer to your mother means your future belongs to her decline. I wish I could say I fought him. I didn't. Because the truth is, some part of me had already decided before he said it. Daughters are trained early for this kind of surrender. Not dramatically, quietly, through praise, through guilt, through usefulness mistaken for love. So my mother came home with me. At first we called it temporary, then we stopped calling it anything at all. The first year was the hardest. Wheelchair ramps, insurance forms, physical therapy 3 times a week, pill organizers the size of tackle boxes, nights where she rang the bell beside her bed every hour because she couldn't get comfortable and wouldn't let me guess wrong. She could still speak then, mostly. Slowly. Frustrated. She hated needing help, which meant she hated the person giving it. That person was usually me. "You're folding that wrong. That soup is too salty. You missed a pill. Don't hover." She never made caregiving easy enough to feel saintly. That probably saved me. I never got to romanticize any of it. I just did it. Mark visited at Christmas that first year. He brought a designer fleece blanket and a bakery tin of cookies my mother said were too sweet. Andrea stood near the doorway of the guest room and looked around like she was inspecting an Airbnb. "I don't know how you do it," she said. It sounded like praise. It wasn't. It was distance dressed up as admiration. By the second year, Mark started sending checks every few months. Not enough to cover the real costs. Enough to say he contributed. The messages always said the same thing. For Mom's care. As if I were an invoice. As if love could be itemized into receipts and sent from Columbus. By the third year, family had settled into a story. That's how these things happen. No one announces the new version. They just repeat it until it sounds natural. Claire lives with her mother. Claire doesn't really have a life of her own. Claire probably stays because the house is paid off. My Aunt Linda once said over potato salad at a church luncheon, "Well, at least Claire's not paying rent." She smiled when she said it. Like she was being generous. I smiled back because what else do you do when people reduce your exhaustion to a housing arrangement? By year 4, my own body had changed. My wrists hurt from lifting. My lower back never really stopped aching. I started sleeping lightly, always listening for the bell from my mother's room, or the sharp intake of breath that meant she was awake and angry at being awake. My world got smaller. Bathroom rails, medication refills, how far the wheelchair could turn without scraping the trim in the hallway. Meanwhile, Mark's life got larger. A boat share with clients. A golf trip to Florida. Photos of wine tastings Andrea posted online with captions about gratitude. My mother still lit up for him. Even after months of silence, his name on her phone made her posture change. Some loyalties survive everything, even evidence. The 5th year, her speech was mostly gone. But her eyes stayed sharp. Too sharp sometimes. She saw who came, who didn't. Who called only when tax season approached. Who asked how she was, and who asked whether the house title was still straightforward. That last one came from Mark. On a Sunday afternoon. He thought I was outside getting the mail. I was in the hallway. He was in the kitchen on speakerphone. And just to be practical, he said nothing complicated's been done with the estate right. I stood there holding grocery coupons and a gas bill and felt something in me harden, not break, harden. That night, while I was helping my mother into bed, she motioned weakly for me to lean closer. She spoke in fragments then, soft, effortful. But I had learned her language by then, I know she said. I looked at her. Know what her fingers closed around my wrist with surprising strength. Who was here? I didn't answer. I didn't need to. She knew. That was the beginning of something. Not revenge. Recognition. The 6th year was quieter. Her body smaller. Her room warmer because she was always cold. One morning she asked for lipstick. A pale pink shade she hadn't worn since before the stroke. I put it on for her with a trembling hand. She looked in the mirror a long time, then turned to me. And for the first time in years, she said something gentle. "Thank you." 2 words. Late, but real. She died the next Monday while I was changing her pillowcase. No dramatic speech, no cinematic last breath. Just a soft exhale that did not return. I stood there holding a clean pillowcase and felt the house go still around me. Then I called Mark. He answered on the 3rd ring. "Mom's gone," I said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'll drive down tomorrow." Not, I'm sorry. Not how are you? Tomorrow. And now here we were. The funeral. His copy of the will. Andrea's polished cruelty. The whole family watching. Me holding a paper that had already expired 2 years earlier. I read the last line. Then laughed. Because my mother, capable to the end, had done one final practical thing. And my brother had walked into her funeral certain he understood her better than he did. The 6 years after my mother's stroke did not unfold like a story. They unfolded like maintenance, small adjustments, daily negotiations, a series of decisions that rarely felt dramatic, but slowly reshaped my life. At first, people came often. Neighbors brought casseroles. Church friends stopped by with magazines and flowers that wilted too quickly in the warm living room. Mark visited twice that first month. He walked through the house with his hands in his pockets, asking careful questions about medications and therapy schedules. Andrea followed him like a polite guest in someone else's home. She complimented the curtains. She told my mother she looked strong. Then she whispered to me in the kitchen, "You're amazing for doing this." The tone suggested something closer to disbelief than admiration. I nodded and rinsed a soup bowl in the sink. Back then, I still believed people would stay involved. I believed families functioned like teams. The illusion lasted about 3 months. After that, visits became shorter. Phone calls replaced them. Mark developed a rhythm. Every few weeks he would call on a Sunday afternoon. "How's Mom doing?" About the same, I would say. "Good," he'd reply. Then he'd add, "Let me know if anything changes," as if a stroke recovery were a weather report. Andrea stopped visiting entirely after the second Thanksgiving. She claimed the drive aggravated her back. Instead, she sent gift baskets at Christmas, imported crackers, chocolate-covered cherries, things my mother couldn't eat. The first year I kept a notebook on the kitchen counter. Medication times, blood pressure readings, physical therapy exercises, insurance claim numbers. I wrote everything down because the doctors told me accuracy mattered, but the notebook also became a record of something else. Who showed up? Who didn't? When Mark sent a check? When he forgot? The checks always arrived with the same note. For Mom's care. Never, "How are you holding up?" Never. "Do you need anything?" Just the implication that his contribution had balanced the ledger. It never did. Caregiving rearranges a house, not just the furniture, the entire logic of movement. I moved a dresser 3 inches once because the wheelchair kept catching on the corner. That felt like a major victory. I installed handrails in the hallway, a shower seat, a bell by the bedside. The bell was supposed to be for emergencies. My mother used it for everything. Water, pill reminders, blanket adjustments, loneliness. She hated being dependent, which meant she hated needing me. Some nights she would ring the bell 3 times in an hour, then apologize the 4th time. I stopped counting. After a while, the bell became part of the house's soundscape, like the refrigerator humming, or the furnace kicking on. By the 2nd year, my job had changed. I was still in medical billing, but I had switched to remote work. Part-time. Flexible hours. Flexible was the polite word. Unstable was the accurate one. My supervisor was kind about it. "You're doing what family does," she told me once. I didn't correct her. Because that sentence assumes everyone agrees on what family does. Mine had reached a different conclusion. Mark's visits shrank to holidays. Even then, they were brief. Christmas morning, Easter lunch, 2 hours at most. He always brought something expensive, new blankets, electronic photo frames, a massage pillow my mother refused to use. Andrea would walk through the house commenting on things. "You should repaint this hallway. The carpet looks tired. You're lucky the mortgage is paid off." That last one became her favorite, as if the house itself were the compensation for everything happening inside it. By the 3rd year, the rest of the family had adjusted their understanding of my life. It happens slowly. A new narrative forms because it's easier than the truth. Claire lives with her mother. Claire doesn't really have a career anymore. Claire probably stays because it's convenient. My Aunt Linda said once at a church luncheon, "Well, at least Claire doesn't have rent." She smiled when she said it. Everyone laughed politely. I smiled too. Not because it was funny, because unpaid labor makes people uncomfortable. If they acknowledge it, they might have to respect it. Respect requires gratitude. Gratitude requires effort. The 4th year was when my body began to notice the strain. My wrists hurt from lifting. My lower back ached constantly. I slept lightly, always listening for the bell, or the sharp intake of breath that meant my mother had woken up confused. Caregiving teaches you to exist in fragments. 20 minutes of sleep, 10 minutes of paperwork, 3 hours of quiet waiting while someone struggles to form a sentence. Meanwhile, Mark's life grew louder. Boat pictures, golf tournaments, wine tastings Andrea posted online with captions about blessings. People commented with hearts and clapping emojis. My mother would stare at those photos on her tablet and say, "He looks happy." She never said he should visit. Some loyalties survive everything, even absence. The 5th year, her speech was mostly gone, but her eyes stayed sharp. Too sharp sometimes. She watched the door whenever a car passed, listened whenever the phone rang. One afternoon, Mark called while I was outside taking out the trash. His voice came through the kitchen speaker. And just to be practical, he said nothing complicated's been done with the estate right. I froze in the doorway. Andrea laughed quietly in the background. "You always think ahead," she said. Mark continued, "I mean, the house title is still simple, right?" I stepped into the hallway without making a sound. My mother was in the living room. Her head tilted slightly toward the speaker. Her eyes were open, listening. That night when I helped her into bed, she motioned for me to lean closer. Her words came slowly, broken, but clear enough. "I know." I looked at her. Know what her fingers closed around my wrist. "Who was here?" I didn't answer. She didn't need me to. She had been keeping her own quiet record. The 6th year was quieter, her body smaller, her world reduced to the bedroom window in the hallway. One morning she asked for lipstick, a pale pink shade she hadn't worn since before the stroke. I put it on for her with shaking hands. She looked at herself in the mirror for a long time. Then she looked at me and said something I hadn't heard in years. "Thank you." 2 words. Soft, late, but real. I didn't realize then how much those words mattered. Not until the funeral. Not until my brother stood in that fellowship hall with a copy of the will and the certainty of someone who thought the story had already been written. Because while everyone else had been building their version of my life, my mother had been building her own. And 2 years before she died, she had called a lawyer. The first time my brother started asking about the will, it didn't sound like greed. It sounded like responsibility. That's how those conversations begin. Softly, reasonably, hidden inside practical questions. It was a Sunday afternoon late in the 4th year after my mother's stroke, rain tapping lightly against the kitchen windows. My mother was asleep in the living room recliner, the one we had modified with cushions and a side rail. I was making soup. The phone rang. Mark's name lit up the screen. I answered with my shoulder while chopping carrots. "Hey." "Hey," he said. "How's Mom about the same?" "Good." That was his usual response. Not relief, just acknowledgement. Then he paused, and I heard Andrea's voice faintly in the background. He lowered his tone slightly. "I was thinking about something practical." I waited. "When people get older," he continued, "they sometimes make changes to paperwork. What paperwork, you know? Wills, titles, that kind of thing." I placed the knife down on the counter. "She hasn't mentioned anything." "Good," he said quickly. "Because I think stability matters. Stability for the family." I leaned against the sink. "What exactly are you asking?" Another pause. "Well, the house is still set up the same way, right?" I didn't answer immediately. That silence seemed to make him uncomfortable. "You know," he continued, "split evenly like Mom always intended." Split evenly. The phrase floated there like a rule everyone was supposed to respect. But rules in families often rely on assumptions, and assumptions collapse the moment someone actually checks them. "Why are you asking?" I said. "I'm not asking anything," he replied. "Just making sure everything stays fair." Fair. That word again. In families like ours, fair usually meant equal, but equal doesn't always mean honest, especially when one person carries the weight. "I'll let you know if anything changes," I said. That ended the conversation. But it wasn't the end of the topic. From that day on, Mark started mentioning the future more often, not directly, just in passing. Holiday visits, short phone calls, small comments. "You're lucky Mom's house is paid off. That neighborhood's value has really gone up. You ever think about selling after—" You know. The sentence never finished, but the implication always did. Andrea became less subtle. She would walk through the house during visits and run her hand along the walls like a realtor inspecting a property. "You've kept it nice," she'd say. "Real estate like this doesn't come around often." The first time she said it, I pretended not to hear. The second time, I understood exactly what she meant. The third time, I realized something else. They had already decided what the ending would look like. In their version of the story, I had spent 6 years living comfortably in my mother's house. Mark had contributed financially, and when the time came, we would divide everything evenly. That narrative worked perfectly for them. It required no reflection, no guilt, no acknowledgement of who had actually stayed. The 5th year was when their questions became more direct. Mark visited in early spring. Andrea didn't come. She had a work event which usually meant something involving wine and photos. Mark sat at the kitchen table while I finished feeding my mother lunch. When I came back, he had opened the mail stack. "Property taxes went up," he said. "Everything's going up." He nodded. Then he asked, "Mom still understands financial decisions, right?" The question was framed carefully, but the meaning underneath it was clear. "She understands what matters," I said. He leaned back. "You know what I mean." "Yes." "So, she knows who's here." Mark frowned. "That's not what I asked." "It's the only answer that matters." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he shrugged. "Well, when the time comes, we'll sort everything out." That sentence stayed with me. Not because it was aggressive, because it was confident. He believed the outcome was already settled. Andrea believed it too. The rest of the family did as well. Even my Aunt Linda repeated the same assumption one afternoon while we stood beside the church coffee table. "Well," she said cheerfully, "at least Claire will get half the house someday." Half. Everyone said the word like it was already printed. Half the house, half the accounts, half the life. No one asked whether half made sense, because no one had seen the other half. The midnight alarms, the hospital runs, the months where my own world shrank to the distance between my mother's bedroom and the pharmacy counter. Meanwhile, Mark's life kept expanding. New car, new clients, a vacation house rental in Michigan one summer, photos online with captions about family values. The irony of that phrase never seemed to reach him. The 6th year changed something, not in the house, in my mother. Her speech had nearly disappeared, but her mind remained sharp, sharper than people expected. One evening in late October, after another phone call from Mark about estate planning, she motioned for me to sit beside her. Her hand shook as she reached for mine. I leaned closer so I could hear her. The words came slowly. Broken, but unmistakable. "Call. Mr. Lawson." I knew the name. Mr. Lawson was the attorney who had handled my parents' paperwork for years. "Why?" I asked gently. She squeezed my wrist. "Need. Change." I didn't ask what kind of change, because in that moment I understood something important. My mother had been listening. For 6 years she had watched who showed up, who stayed, who asked about her, and who asked about her house. A week later, Mr. Lawson sat at the same kitchen table where Mark had once talked about fairness. He opened a leather folder, reviewed documents, asked my mother quiet questions. She answered in nods and small movements. Then she looked at me and said something with surprising clarity. Fair isn't equal. Mr. Lawson nodded slowly. Yes, Helen, he said. I believe you're right. 2 months later, my mother passed away, and now standing in the church fellowship hall with my brother waving an outdated will like it was a winning lottery ticket, I finally understood what she had meant. Because Mark thought he knew the ending. But my mother had rewritten it 2 years earlier, and the lawyer was about to explain exactly how. The day my mother asked me to call Mr. Lawson, the house felt unusually quiet. Not peaceful, intentional. She had been restless all morning. Not physically, mentally. Her eyes moved constantly. Watching the door, watching the hallway, watching me. By the 6th year, I understood her moods without words. When she was tired, her shoulders sank. When she was in pain, she closed her eyes and breathed shallowly. But that morning, something else was happening. She was deciding something. I had just finished helping her with breakfast when she lifted her hand and motioned toward the phone. Her fingers trembled slightly. Call Lawson, she said. The words came slowly but clearly enough. I wiped my hands on a dish towel. Mr. Lawson. She nodded. Her eyes were steady. I stood there for a moment, because I knew what she meant. Not exactly what she intended to change. But why? For 6 years she had listened to the conversations happening around her, the ones people thought she couldn't understand. Phone calls in the kitchen, whispers in the hallway, questions about property, questions about the future. She had heard them all. I dialed the number. Mr. Lawson answered on the second ring. His voice was calm, professional, the same voice that had handled my parents' paperwork for decades. Lawson and Green. Mr. Lawson, I said. This is Claire Parker. There was a pause, then recognition. Claire. How is your mother? I looked at the living room. She was watching me closely. She'd like to see you. Another pause. I understand, he said. I'll come by this afternoon. The call ended quietly. I placed the phone back on the counter. My mother relaxed slightly into her chair. Not relieved, resolved. When Mr. Lawson arrived, he didn't bring sympathy first. He brought a leather folder. That told me everything. He shook my hand. Then he stepped into the living room and crouched beside my mother's chair so they were eye level. Helen, he said gently. It's good to see you. She nodded. Her right hand moved slowly across the armrest. I had seen that movement before. It meant she was gathering strength. Need. Change, she said. Mr. Lawson didn't react with surprise. He had been a lawyer long enough to understand that family decisions often arrive late. He opened the folder. Inside were several documents. My mother watched every page, every movement of his pen. He asked questions slowly, making sure she understood each one. Do you feel comfortable making changes to your will today? She nodded. Do you understand what those changes mean? Another nod. He turned slightly toward me. Claire, I'll need you to step out for a moment while we discuss specifics. I hesitated. Not because I didn't trust him. Because leaving felt strange after 6 years of being involved in every detail of her life. But I understood why. I stepped into the kitchen, closed the door halfway, and waited. The house was silent except for the low murmur of their conversation. I couldn't hear the words, only the rhythm. My mother speaking slowly, Mr. Lawson responding carefully. 20 minutes passed, then the door opened. He stood there with a document in his hand. We'll need 2 witnesses, he said. I nodded. The neighbors across the street were retired and usually home in the afternoons. Within 10 minutes, they were standing in the living room beside the recliner. Mrs. Keller adjusted her glasses. Mr. Keller cleared his throat. Neither asked questions. They simply watched as my mother signed her name with a slow, determined hand. Her handwriting had become uneven, but it was still hers. Mr. Lawson signed next. The Kellers followed. The document was placed carefully into the folder. And just like that, the decision was finished. No speeches, no dramatic announcements, just a quiet correction written into legal language. After the witnesses left, Mr. Lawson stood beside the chair again. "Helen," he said, "are you comfortable with the changes we discussed?" She nodded. Then she looked at me. Her eyes softened slightly. Not emotional, just certain. Mr. Lawson closed the folder. "I'll keep the original," he said. "Copies will be filed with the court." He shook my hand before leaving. "You've done remarkable work here," he said quietly. I didn't answer, because by that point the work didn't feel remarkable. It felt ordinary, the kind of ordinary that fills years without anyone noticing. After he left, the house returned to its usual rhythm: medication schedules, laundry, quiet afternoons. The will was never mentioned again. Not by my mother. Not by me. But something in the house had shifted. Not physically, emotionally. My mother seemed calmer after that day, like a task had been completed. The months that followed were gentle in a way the earlier years hadn't been. Her speech faded further. Her appetite shrank. But her eyes stayed sharp, always watching, always aware. The morning she asked for lipstick was the only time she had shown interest in appearance since the stroke. I opened the small makeup bag she had kept in the bathroom drawer. The lipstick was pale pink, nearly worn down to the base. I applied it carefully. Her lips trembled slightly. When she looked into the mirror, she smiled faintly. Then she turned toward me. "Thank you?" 2 words. Clear enough that I didn't have to guess. That was the last full sentence she ever spoke. 3 weeks later, she died quietly in her bed. And 2 days after that, my brother arrived at the funeral with a copy of the will he thought still existed, standing in the church fellowship hall, waving that outdated document like proof of fairness. He didn't know about the afternoon in the living room, the witnesses, the pen in my mother's shaking hand, the sentence she had spoken to the lawyer before signing, a sentence that explained everything. Fair isn't equal. And now the lawyer was standing across the room, opening his folder, preparing to read the words she had chosen instead. Mark didn't notice the lawyer at first. He was too busy enjoying the attention. Funerals have a strange way of turning grief into a kind of audience. People stand in small circles, coffee cups in their hands, waiting for someone to explain what happens next. Mark liked those moments. He liked rooms where people watched him. Andrea stood beside him with her hand lightly on his arm, smiling in that quiet, confident way she always used when she believed she had already won. "This isn't complicated," Mark said, tapping the copy of the will against the table. "Mom always believed in fairness." The word fairness again. It had become his favorite argument. Andrea nodded toward me. "Claire had the house for 6 years. She said it lightly, like she was describing a vacation. That's basically her inheritance already." A few people in the room shifted uncomfortably, not because they disagreed, because no one wanted to be the first to say anything. My Aunt Linda stepped closer. She folded her arms and looked at me. "Well, she said Mark does have a point." I didn't answer. She had said the same thing years earlier about the house. At least Claire doesn't pay rent. That sentence had traveled through the family like a fact. Not one person had ever asked how much rent 6 years of caregiving might cost. Mark lifted the paper again. "The house sells the investment split 50-50. He looked around the room. "That's what Mom wanted." Andrea leaned toward him and whispered something that made him smile. Probably something about patience, about letting people adjust. Then the door opened. Mr. Lawson stepped into the fellowship hall carrying his leather folder. He moved slowly. Not hesitant. Just deliberate. The quiet kind of authority that comes from explaining the same family mistake 100 different ways. Mark noticed him immediately. His smile tightened. "Mr. Lawson," he said. "Good to see you." Andrea straightened her posture. "We were just discussing the will." Mr. Lawson nodded politely. "Yes," he said. "I understand." He set the folder down on the table beside the coffee urn. The room grew quieter. People who had been pretending not to listen began inching closer. Funerals make people curious about money in ways they rarely admit. Mark slid the copy of the will across the table. "We've already reviewed it," he said. "Everything seems clear." "Mr.?" Lawson glanced at the document briefly, then he looked back up. "Yes," he said calmly. "That document was clear." Andrea frowned slightly. Was Mr. Lawson opened the folder, pulled out a crisp sheet of paper. He placed it gently beside the old copy. "This," he said, "is the updated will your mother signed 2 years ago." The silence in the room changed shape. Mark stared at the page. "That's not possible." Andrea's voice sharpened. "Why would she change it?" Mr. Lawson didn't answer immediately. Instead, he adjusted his glasses and looked down at the document. "My role today," he said, "is simply to read what your mother wrote." He cleared his throat softly, then began. "I, Helen Parker, being of sound mind." The opening paragraphs were legal language, formal, measured, the kind of sentences that exist mainly to prevent arguments. Mark shifted impatiently. Andrea crossed her arms. Then Mr. Lawson reached the section everyone cared about. "To my son, Mark Parker, I leave the sum of $50,000. Andrea inhaled sharply. What Mark leaned forward. "That's not right," Mr. Lawson continued. "To my daughter, Claire Parker, who cared for me in my home during the final years of my life." His voice remained calm. "I leave the remaining assets of my estate, including the residence and all investment accounts." The room went still. Not dramatically, just the quiet stillness that follows the collapse of an assumption. Andrea's face drained of color. Mark stared at the page like it had betrayed him personally. "That's not what Mom wanted." Mr. Lawson looked up. "It's what she signed." Andrea stepped forward. "She manipulated her." I didn't respond. Mark turned toward me. "You think you deserve this?" His voice had lost its smooth confidence. Now it carried something sharper. I met his eyes. "No." The answer stopped him. Andrea blinked. "What I didn't stay for the money," I said. The words felt simple, almost boring, but they landed harder than anger would have. Mark looked around the room, searching for agreement. My Aunt Linda shifted her weight. Then slowly she spoke. "Well," she said, "I guess Helen knew who was here." Andrea snapped her head toward her. "You're taking her side." Linda shrugged. "I'm taking Helen's side." That sentence broke something in the room. Not loudly, just enough. Mark's shoulders stiffened. Andrea's lips tightened into a thin line. But the balance had changed. The story they had arrived to tell was no longer the only version in the room. Mr. Lawson turned one more page. "There is one additional clause," he said. Andrea laughed nervously. "Of course there is." He read the final paragraph. "Acknowledging the 6 years of personal care provided by my daughter Claire, I wish to ensure she is compensated fairly for her time and sacrifice." He closed the folder. "That concludes the will." For a moment no one spoke. Then Mark looked at me again. Not angry now, confused. Like he had just realized he had misunderstood something fundamental about our mother. Across the room the church clock ticked softly. And for the first time since the funeral began, the room stopped looking at me like a freeloader. They looked at me like someone who had stayed. Mark didn't explode the way people expect in stories like this. He didn't flip a table or shout. He stood there, still, like a man trying to solve a math problem that had suddenly changed numbers. Andrea reacted first. Her voice came out sharp. "This is ridiculous." No one answered. The word ridiculous hung in the air, waiting for someone to rescue it. But no one did. Mr. Lawson closed the folder slowly. He had the expression of a man who had seen this moment before. Different family. Same realization. Mark looked at the paper again. Then at me. "You knew about this?" "Yes." His jaw tightened. "And you didn't say anything." I didn't answer immediately, because silence can be more accurate than defense. Andrea stepped closer. "This is manipulation." "No," Mr. Lawson said calmly. "This is documentation." She turned toward him. "You're telling me Helen suddenly decided her son was worth $50,000. Mr. Lawson folded his hands. "I'm telling you Helen made a deliberate decision." Andrea's laugh was thin. "After 6 years of living with Claire, I met her eyes." "You mean 6 years of caring for her?" Andrea opened her mouth, then closed it again. Because the room had started shifting. People were thinking now. Actually thinking. My Aunt Linda was the first to say it out loud. "Well," she said slowly. "Claire was here." Mark shot her a look. "You're taking her side too." Linda shrugged. "I'm taking the side of reality." That irritated him more than the will, because Mark preferred arguments where loyalty mattered more than facts. He turned back to Mr. Lawson. "She was sick. Yes. She wasn't thinking clearly." Mr. Lawson's voice remained steady. "Helen passed a competency evaluation before signing the revision." Mark blinked. "What is standard procedure for major estate changes?" Andrea crossed her arms tighter. "This is unbelievable." I didn't speak. I didn't need to. The will was already doing the work. Mark ran a hand through his hair. "So that's it." His voice sounded smaller now. "That's how she repaid me." Mr. Lawson tilted his head slightly. "Your mother didn't frame it as repayment. How did she frame it?" The lawyer glanced at the document again. Then he said quietly, "As recognition." The word settled into the room with surprising weight. Recognition. 6 years reduced to a single legal term. Mark stared at the table, and the house, Mr. Lawson nodded. "It transfers to Claire." Andrea shook her head. "That house should be sold." "According to the will, Mr. Lawson said that decision belongs to Claire." Andrea turned toward me again. "You think this makes you better than us?" "No, you're enjoying this." "No." The calm in my voice seemed to frustrate her more than anger would have. Because anger gives people something to argue with. Calm gives them a mirror. Mark exhaled slowly. "You could split it. It wasn't a demand. Not quite. More like a test." I looked at him. "Why?" He blinked. "Because we're family." The word sounded thinner now, less confident. "Were we family when you told everyone I was living here rent-free?" I asked. He didn't answer. Andrea did. "You were." That's one way to describe it. Mark rubbed his face. "You could at least consider it." "I did consider it." And Mom already made the decision." He looked toward the front door, like he needed fresh air, or distance, or time. I didn't know she felt like that. I believed him. That was the strange part. Mark had built his version of the story so completely that he had never considered the possibility of another one. Mr. Lawson slipped the document back into the folder. "If there are no further questions," he said, "we can schedule the formal estate transfer meeting next week." No one stopped him. Andrea looked like she wanted to, but the argument had lost its footing. The room had shifted too far. When the lawyer left, the fellowship hall felt different. Not tense. Just quiet. My Aunt Linda stepped closer to me. Her voice was softer than before. "I didn't realize it was that bad," she said. I nodded once. It was. She looked down at the floor. "Well," she murmured, "I guess Helen saw more than we did." Mark walked toward the door without another word. Andrea followed him. Her heels clicked sharply against the tile. Halfway across the room she stopped, turned back toward me. "This isn't over," she said. I met her eyes. "It already is." She stared for a moment. Then she left. The room slowly returned to the ordinary sounds of a church gathering. Coffee cups, quiet conversations, chairs scraping the floor. But something had changed. Not the money, the understanding. For 6 years, people had assumed I stayed because I needed the house. Now they knew something else. I had stayed because someone had to. And my mother had made sure that difference was written down. The house felt different after the funeral. Not emptier, just quieter in a way that made space for thought. For 6 years, the rhythm of my days had been shaped by someone else's needs. Medication alarms, doctor appointments, the small sounds that come from a bedroom when someone can't move easily. Now the silence was wide, uninterrupted. For the first week, I still woke up at the same hours, listening, waiting for the bell that would never ring again. Old habits don't disappear quickly. They fade, like footsteps in snow. Mark called 3 days after the funeral. I watched his name appear on my phone. Let it ring twice. Then answered. Claire. His voice sounded different, less certain. "Hi." There was a pause. Then he cleared his throat. "I've been thinking about what happened." "That's good." I didn't know she felt that way. I didn't answer, because the truth was simpler than anything he was about to say. He had never asked. "I should have visited more," he continued. Another pause. "Probably," Andrea's voice murmured faintly in the background. He lowered his tone. "Look, I know things got tense." Tense. You know what I mean. I did. But I didn't rescue him from the word. "I don't want this to destroy the family," he said. The phrase sounded practiced, like something he had rehearsed. "Families usually need something solid to destroy," I replied. Another silence. He sighed. "So that's it. What do you mean, you just keep everything?" The question wasn't angry, just confused, as if fairness still meant something symmetrical. "I'm keeping what Mom chose," I said. He exhaled slowly. "And the house, I'm staying here for now." Andrea spoke again in the background, this time louder. He muted the phone for a moment. I could still hear muffled arguing. Then he returned. "Look," he said quietly. "Maybe later we can talk about something working things out." I leaned against the kitchen counter, the same counter where I had once taken midnight notes about medication schedules. Mark, I said working things out would have happened years ago. He didn't answer, because that was the part he couldn't rewrite. The 6 years already existed. Nothing he said now could rearrange them. "I have to go," he finally said. "Okay." Before he hung up, he added one more sentence. "I didn't realize how much you did." That was the closest he came to an apology. It wasn't enough, but it was honest. The rest of the family changed slowly after the funeral. Not dramatically, just enough to reveal how much they had misunderstood. My Aunt Linda stopped by one afternoon with a casserole. She stood in the doorway awkwardly. "I figured you might not feel like cooking," she said. I let her in. We sat at the kitchen table, the same one where Mark had once talked about fairness. She looked around the room carefully. "I never realized how much equipment you had in here," she said. "Wheelchair ramps, medical supplies, pill organizers, 6 years of invisible work. Most people only see it once it's over." "I should have helped more," she said quietly. I shrugged. "You didn't know. I should have asked." That sentence mattered more. Asking requires attention. And attention had been missing for a long time. Outside the family, the story traveled quickly. Church circles, neighborhood conversations, People who had once nodded politely when someone mentioned Claire living with her mother. Now they understood something else. Living with someone and caring for them are not the same thing. 2 weeks later, I met with Mr. Lawson to finalize the estate paperwork. He slid the final documents across the desk. "You handled that situation with unusual restraint," he said. "Did I? Most people would have celebrated." I thought about that. About Andrea's sharp voice, Mark's confusion, the room full of relatives realizing they had misunderstood the story. "It wasn't a victory," I said. "It was a correction." He nodded. "That's a healthy way to see it." Before I left his office, he added something else. "Your mother was very clear about one thing." He opened the folder again, just long enough to reread a single line. She said recognition matters more than fairness. I smiled slightly. That sounded exactly like her. Months passed. The house slowly became mine again. Not a hospital, not a waiting room, just a house. One evening I stood in the living room beside the window where my mother used to sit. The sunset turned the glass orange. I remembered something she had said years before the stroke. Back when life still moved quickly. "People always think inheritance is about money," she told me once. "It's really about who paid attention." I didn't understand that sentence then. I do now. And sometimes when people ask how the story ended, I tell them something simple. My brother came to the funeral expecting half. He left with $50,000. I left with the house. But more importantly, I left with the truth written down.